that around the dinner table tonight we ate our bread with tears, and that's a phrase that can be used in ancient literature to mean to eat your bread with sorrow, to be in great pain. But we ate our bread with great joy tonight, all of us recounting many of the great things that God has done on our behalf. And you know what's amazing? I've never sat around a table with a group of individuals in which they were talking about the great victories they had won that caused the hearers to break out in tears. But only when we speak about the great victories that God has wrought in our lives do the tears come forth. When we realize how undeserving, how unwilling, how pitiful, how small, how faithless that we truly are as men and women, and how good our God is. This is always about Him, and it is always about His goodness. Always. And our joy comes not from our performance, but our joy comes from His faithfulness and His performance. I've been counseling a young seminary student, and he's just totally distraught. He just lives in anguish. He lives in doubt. He looks at his failures, his problems, his shortcomings, and everything else. He loses all joy, and he lives in despair. And I spoke to him recently and then wrote him again over the same matter, and I said, "Young man," I said, "there's a really good chance you're more spiritual than I am. But I'm a lot happier than you are. And the reason for that is your eyes are placed upon you. You hope to find your satisfaction, your peace, your salvation, your joy in your performance. I've lived long enough with God and failed enough times to know that's an impossibility. I look to Christ. And His perfect work is never a cause for a ceasing of joy. I always have joy regardless of my circumstance, regardless even of my failure, my shortcomings, and my sin. I have joy because my life, my salvation is founded upon the finished work of Christ. And that is so important. That is more than just words. That's salvation. Now, I want us to go again to Hebrews chapter 11. We've been studying faith, walking by faith. And in verse 1 we learned that we could have assurance of things that we hope for, and we could have convictions that things exist and things that are that we have never seen, only for one reason, and that God has spoken. That God has spoken. And if you and I are to ever have faith, we must be filled with the revelation of God. We must be filled with the knowledge of God. It is so important to understand that faith is nothing more than presumption. It's nothing more than a leap in the dark if it is not based upon, "Thus saith the Lord." And so our God has promised us. And in verse 2 we saw that men of old gained approval by faith. This is always the case. And yet this goes totally against every form of man-centered, man-invented religion. All of that has to do with gaining approval by works, gaining approval by performance, gaining approval by doing this or doing that. But we understand that men of old in the Bible, and women of old, as we will see, they always gained their approval before God through faith, through believing Him. Something very important about this, and something I always tell people, that you will never be anything except a recipient of God's grace. That's all you will ever be. And we reach out, we extend our hands to be recipients of that grace by faith in Jesus Christ. In verse 3, by faith we understand that the worlds were prepared by the Word of God, so that what is seen was not made out of things that are visible. This is such an important statement. If we can believe, if we believe that there is a God, and we believe that this God has such power that He can not only create but also sustain the entire universe, then is there anything impossible for Him? Is there anything impossible for Him? We wonder sometimes, can I trust God with my family? Can I trust God with my finances? Can I trust God with my children? You trust Him every day with these things, whether you know it or not, because He sustains the very universe in which they exist. And if we come to the conclusion that He can do the most miraculous, which would be to create a universe and sustain it, then every other thing is trite before Him. Every other thing is simple. It's a tiny thing. If I can solve this one question, is there a God? Is He who He says He is? Then everything else is over. I can trust Him. I can trust Him. Now, in verse 4, by faith Abel offered to God a better sacrifice than Cain. This is very, very important. That his sacrifice was not acceptable because the difference between blood and grain and this and that and every sort of thing. His sacrifice wasn't more pleasing to God because of something that was in it. It was more pleasing to God because it was offered by faith. He truly believed, as we are going to see later, he came to God believing that God was and that God was the rewarder. I can imagine Abel taking his offering it to God in knowledge that he had something to offer because God gave it to him. And that he was giving something back to God, knowing that it was the right thing to do and that God is the rewarder of those who seek Him. Where Cain, on the other hand, is probably thinking, as so many people do, I don't know why I'm having to give this to God. I had to earn it with my own sweat. How many people speak that way with regard to their time, their employment, and their finances? Well, I don't know why I need to offer this to God. I'm the one that had to go out there and earn it. Little do you know, old proud and stupid man, the very breath that you drew every second of every day came from Him. The power, the ability, the intellect, whatever's required to do your job, it came from Him. Abel recognizes, I have something to offer because God gave me something to offer. And Cain's thinking he did it all by himself. All by himself. And that offering it was just some pathetic, stupid little religious ritual. Why do I even want to bother with this stuff? I'll do it because it's to be done. There's really no use in it. Now, none of us would say that, but we spoke last night about something very important. We do many religious things, even good things, not by faith. When we sing a hymn unto God, when you sang here this evening, it should have been by faith, believing that God is, believing that God receives such a sacrifice, believing that it was pleasing to God, that it was actually doing something, that it was actually reaching the throne of God, that God was actually hearing your song, your singing, your heart. It just wasn't some empty religious activity that you were doing. This is also good for the servant of the Lord who is burdened by many, many years of service and many, many years maybe of not seeing much fruit, but realizing, no, there is a reason to offer. There is a reason to give. By faith, by faith, by faith. And then we see that through which he obtained the testimony that he was righteous. Something very important. Righteousness comes through faith. Always through faith. And this is very important because faith is the opposite of works. And being the opposite of works, it is also a denial that God could ever be a man's debtor. Do you know, when I study religion and I study things of that sort and study cults and everything else that sometimes I have to study, I'm well aware of something. That every religion on the face of the earth, with the exception of true Christianity, is a religion of works. Now, why is that? Why are men glad to receive a religion of works and yet will practically kill a messenger who comes to them and says, it is free, it is a gift, receive it by faith? Why is that? I'll tell you why. Because men want to be God. You say, well, what on earth does that have? No, men want to be God. Men want to be the greater. You see, the lesser is always blessed by the greater. When you have a religion of works, what you're saying is, you have blessed God. You have made yourself greater than God. God is the one receiving from you. And now, God owes you because of the things you have done. And that's why men love works so much. They would rather have a religion of works than a religion of salvation through grace and by faith. But we see that men have always been approved. They've always been declared righteous, and only by faith. And then it goes on in verse 5, by faith Enoch was taken up so that he would not see death. And we spoke about that last night. There's a very, very important part here. It says, and he was not found because God took him. I love that. I would like for God to do this to me. You say, well, that's preposterous. God doesn't do that anymore. Where did you read that? God can do it if He wants to. God can do anything He wants to. But I would like that to happen to me. I really would. It would be nice not to die. It says here something very important. He did not see death, and he was not found because God took him up. For he obtained the witness that before his being taken up, he was pleasing to God. Now, who witnessed this? God witnessed this. God witnessed and saw that this man was pleasing. Now, here's something very important to the carnal Christian. There is no such thing, but people who call them Christians call themselves Christians, though they live in carnality. Here's something very important. There is a doctrine out there that seems to say that men get saved, yet they never really grow in the Lord. They never have a passion for the Lord. They're always carnal. They never grow in sanctification. But bless God, they're saved. And then when they cross over, they're transformed when they're in heaven, and they become pleasing to God. But look at what it says about Enoch. He was pleasing to God before he was taken up. Before he was taken up, he was pleasing to God.